and welcome to Varn Blog. And I am finally doing a commission that was commissioned probably 2 fucking years ago. This is a discussion on Sam Gindin, Socialism for Realists. And in a way, I'm glad I held off on it. I've read this piece, probably 10 times now, getting ready for this. And I can be honest with you, my response to this piece has varied wildly from, this has some interesting incorporations of different tendencies of socialism in it, to what is this reformist horseshit and why can't we kick this guy out of our movement, to well, I guess things are better now than they were when this was written, to where I am now, like, oh, this is pretty terrible, but what's replaced it is even worse. So, where to go from there? And I know that sounds unfair. I'm just giving my biases out in the beginning, but like when we got to the conclusion of the piece, for example, the transformation of the state, the state is neither fused with the revolutionary party nor does it wither, whether it's transformed in terms of its planning and superintending role, the democratization of planning, the relationship to various layers of planning and new capacity of state much encouraged, including red expertise and commitment to develop among public employees. That's not even aiming for a classless society for me, which means out the gate, not aiming towards the goals of communism, not even really aiming towards the goals of what I understand socialism to traditionally be. So it was part of my initial reaction of the Bernie wave, which is like, during the Bernie Corbyn period, socialism became viable for a lot of people, but it also lost its vision of the future in a lot of ways, in that it was mainly the status quo, but nicer with some, I mean, this does imply some major reforms to the entirety of society. I'm not,
which it should be said, this is considerably more demanding than what the vision of either the Bernie or Corbyn campaigns were.
right. Absolutely. In fact, this may be the most ambitious thing out of that milieu from the time. And it's weird because in some ways, to me, this does, like, Catalyst doesn't feel like a very old magazine, even though it's been around for a while. This does not feel like a very old article, although it's the better half of a decade old. And a lot's happened in the intervening time when this was written in 2018. I mean, this was fall 2018 when this came out. People were still discussing it, probably me, in 2021, but it feels very different from what you're going to see coming out of the DSA now, which is either going to be, frankly, borderline third worldist, or it's going to be even more concessionary to the Democrats, depending on what side of that debate you're on. And I find that interesting. I mean, we can go to the prescriptions, but also we need to talk about how this is set up. And I know you and I are going to talk about some things that it indicates that this feels so incredibly of a different milieu than the left does right now. And in a way, I'm going to go ahead and front load this as well. I feel like the left right now is dysfunctional in a way that I'm used to the left being, that the years of 2015 to 2021 were actually dysfunctional in an interesting and different way than the left is right now. And we'll come back to that. But I do find it interesting as a vision for the future, how this, in trying to be for realist, ends up doing something that Marx says you should never do, which is try to put every card on the table ahead of time. That, this is awfully close to a blueprint for a utopia. It's not quite that, but it's getting close to it. And to be frank, it's kind of a milquetoast utopia. But let's go into it. So we were talking off air a little bit about this, and I just did my normal beginning monologue. But Gindin's work, and this article will be in the show notes, came out in 2018. I was familiar with Gindin from his work with Leo Panitch, the making of global capitalism and the socialist challenge to Reza, Sanders, and Corbyn. And it's actually interesting to me how this even feels like a ratcheting down of Panitch, who's now. I interviewed Panitch a long time ago, I guess over a decade ago now, and he died shortly after this was written. I believe maybe even right before it. But I associate Gindin with Panitch for that reason, and I feel like reading this that Panitch was actually maybe more radical in his socialism. So, but it is interesting, like even the title of his other book with Panitch, The Socialist Challenge to Reza, Sanders, and Corbyn. Well, let's look at what's in that second thing. Syriza, Sanders, and Corbyn failed. Like, and in the case of Sanders and Syriza, failed bad. Failed really bad. Like, actually took power. But Syriza's taking of power went ultimately so poorly that you almost wish they didn't win. And so this also feels out of that moment, this kind of, for lack of a better term, technocratic end of left populism. So that's my preface. What are your initial thoughts before we go into this, Elijah?
So I had a kind of a similar feeling in reading it. I've read it like 2 or 3 times, and I do think this is very 2018.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a vision of a socialist political system, which emerges from a context where if an immediate victory of a democratic socialist politics in the US and UK was not necessarily realistic, it was at least possible in a way that it's not now. And from that, I think that it is, from that moment, I think it was a good idea to ask questions like this about how can we actually redesign systems rather than just tinkering around the edges. And I do think one thing which has always been striking to me about the Sanders and the Corbyn campaigns, and I don't know as much about Caesara because of my Anglo bias, I guess, or Anglosphere bias, is how backward facing in some ways both those those movements were. Like I always found Bernie's 2016 slogan, "A future to believe in," much more inspiring than the 2020 slogan of "Not me, us." And the principal movement that was added in between 2016 and 2020 was, of course, the Green New Deal, which was added to an existing agenda of Medicare for all and universal free college. And 2 of those 3 policies consciously call back, supposed victories of left liberalism in the past. A full extension of Medicare from the 1960s, transformation of the American economy in the same way the New Deal transformed the American economy. And even in the case of Corbyn, his hallmark, or one of his hallmark policies, was calling for a green industrial revolution, which in the same way kind of rhetorically looked backward to a new vision of the Industrial Revolution, which originally brought Britain to prominence on the world stage. And
Yeah,
in this way,
go ahead.
in this way, I think that the rhetorical appeal of both Sanders and Corbyn was in some ways primarily based on the relationship to the past and to the missed opportunities of the past or incomplete elements of the past, rather than actually asking, well, what would this look like in the future? That's
Yeah,
my 2 cents here.
no, I think that's a great way. I mean, I used to chide Corbynistas for asking them, how are you going to do your industrial labor policy that you want to do to bring back British labor unions in the industrial sector without empire, given your fucking island? And I never got a realistic answer once. The Green Industrial Revolution, to me, was even more utopian than the Green New Deal, in that it was an international project being sold in a international project, particularly for Britain more than even the US, is that they don't have the raw materials to do that within their own borders. They would have to get them from somewhere else. And it was already clear that Corbyn didn't have a coherent answer to how to keep the remainders and the left Brexit people together, even though the remainders were the majority of his party. He wasn't really one of them. Did not have a real vision for like what a British-led internationalism would be. The number of lack of visions actually is astounding. And instead of how most of the left has interpreted his loss, is they focus in on the smear campaign on anti-Semitism, which is admittedly a smear campaign. I don't think that's why he lost, if I'm quite honest. I think that was used primarily to discipline Corbyn later. I think why he lost was an incoherent response to Brexit, which made neither the remainders or the left Brexit people happy. And the fact that his vision for how to rebuild industrial, ironically, wasn't believed in the industrial areas. It was believed by proletarian-ish young people, but mostly in the South, in London. Which tells me that he didn't really get the people he really needed on board to his coalition. Now, I think you're right that has to do with the fact that both the British and American left feel so defeated that being offered the scraps of a prior broad program from the 60s seems radical given what you've been given in the 80s, 90s, and aughts. But ultimately, it's nostalgia. It is a, for lack of a better term, a hauntological nostalgia almost. Like, oh, we can finally do these reforms, now. Whereas I'm not sure free college means the same thing now that it would have been in 68, 70. I'm not sure that I'm very much for at least socialized insurance as an immediate demand for any socialist platform. But I actually thought that Medicare for all was still somewhat of an anemic policy.
It replaced it, internally compromised for no reason the broader demand for an NHS in the United
Right.
States, for example. So it's, Medicare is popular, but prior to the support for the Medicare for all policy from the left, the most well-liked option for reform was to implement something like the Veterans Health Administration, which would look like the NHS.
Mhm.
And it no longer is.
I mean, we chastise Obama for starting out of the gate compromise, but in some ways that was still the impulse of the left populist in both the U.S. and America. Syriza is a different case. It is still left populism, but it was one more internally rife and was full of all kinds of different tendencies. Giannis Varoufakis has made himself kind of a heroic martyr for it, although he's very much still alive and talking. In fact, the man never shuts the fuck up. But and he gets made a hero in a lot of ways. And the more I learned about actually what he did in Syriza, I have to admit, I hated his guts going in because I thought he sold a vision of left nationalism and Greek independence that they had not prepared for. But I always did admire him, at least for being willing to pull the trigger when the Troika screwed them. And when they weren't willing to do that, they basically got as bad of a deal as they would have gotten trying to go on their own, I think. Whereas at least they would have had some self-control over currency matters had they gone on their own.
I mean, another big difference is that they won electoral power.
Right.
And
although in a weird coalition with a right-wing party, that does need to be like noted. But yeah.
Sure. And neither Corbyn nor Sanders did.
No.
But, you know, from that perspective, I think that to return to this article, what it asked, well, like, what would an actual socialist government look like in the US? And, you know, it kind of, I think, has the underlying assumption that a Bernie Sanders victory is like the easiest way to get there, when you can't even, you can't with the president just like go over the head of Congress. It is literally unconstitutional to abolish the Senate because the Senate is like the basic body of the American Constitution. And so there's, a lot of practical problems before we even get to the practical problems of this utopian vision. But just to introduce the article for people who haven't read it, it essentially has 3 sections. First, when hope rings oddly in our ears, which is basically a call to have some type of utopian vision amongst the left as a means of animating a kind of radical change.
Yeah, it's basically
a radical change.
Is a rebuke to the manifesto critique of not doing that.
Yeah. Which I actually don't really have a problem with. I'm fine with that. I think utopianism as a vision is different from utopianism as a practice.
This is my issue here. This is somewhere in between the vision and the practice. I mean, I do think we need clearer visions of what we talk about when we talk about socialism. And I do think even Marx, basically in private letters, fucks up and gives us some of it. But even for him, I did find it interesting that this quotes the manifesto so much, but basically avoids critique of the Goethe program, which is, the only real place other than maybe the Civil War in France and a couple other things that you have Marx stating what he kind of thinks this positive vision would look like again. Because after the manifesto, you very much get they're not doing programs for a while. We're just not there yet. I mean, Marx has programs he endorses, the left parties in France, for example. But
Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. But he doesn't have we don't get a Marx penned program after the manifesto.
No.
We get basically, ironically, the only positive visions we get is when he is trying to smack down another program. So I found that interesting. I mean, it's all. I mean, I was actually even the references to the right in this article feel weirdly dated for something that's only 6 years old.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, it starts out with a reference to Thatcher as the
Thatcher and
right
Rothbard. I
and
mean,
Rothbard, and then it has like a bunch of like time later discussing like Hayek and like de Maistre, I think.
right.
Is it de Maistre?
I think it is the
Um,
Maestra.
and then like it does not mention the dawn. Oh no, it's Van Mises. Excuse me. Um,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and
Van
uh,
Mises, not the Maestra.
no. And
Um,
then it doesn't discuss Trump at all, uh, which is funny. Or Johnson. Basically, it shies away from a critique of the contemporary right in any way.
no, it's
Um,
it's 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 going after early liberal and libertarian neoliberals, which is, I mean, von Hayek is a neoliberal. Von Mises is not even a neoliberal. He called the neoliberals communists for
Coolest thing he ever did. No.
um uh it probably is the coolest thing he ever did, honestly. But and I mean it's interesting because when leftists misunderstand what neoliberalism is, they take neoliberals at their word, and actually the leftist scholars who study it closely, like Philip Morawski, not so much David Harvey, but Philip Morawski and people around them will point out that, like, no, Von Mises was crazy, but it kind of has a point in that there is a lot of state intervention in neoliberalism, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
public-private partnerships.
Which I believe we've talked about in previous episodes of our
Absolutely.
conversations, if people want to look them up. But I do think like one thing about this is what we're picking up on is what are these guys fighting? They're fighting neoliberalism. The implicit, whenever anybody uses the there is no alternative quote, what they're saying is that neoliberalism has at this point been naturalized and kind of implicitly saying like, hey guys, like Fukuyama was like right, for the time being, we have to figure out a way out. Or picking up on the Mark Fisher, capitalist realism argument. When I think that one of the things which the past decade has demonstrated is that there are alternatives to neoliberalism, maybe not capitalism, but neoliberalism, which are emerging from the right and are bad. Uh, you know, and I don't think it's so forceful of an attempt to consciously change the economic system as occurs on the left or as is fantasized about or talked about on the left. But it is true that the style of management of, say, like a successful Republican one party state in the United States would not look like the Bush years anymore.
Right.
Um, and in this way, I think that the question,
And definitely
uh,
wouldn't look like Reagan or Thatcher.
definitely not. And the question then arises that are you proffering simply an alternative to, uh, you know, a non-reformist, uh, you know, maintained neoliberal program, or do you also have to suggest that there's an alternative to the alternatives which are emerging and are bad, even if they're not, really theoretically coherent, um, and come up looking batshit crazy and stuff like the 2025 project, which we've argued about how real it is, but I think we both agree that it is at least a blueprint for the kind of governance that the Republican Party wants to do in this country, even if they may not succeed in doing it.
Yeah, I mean, my take on the Project 2025, which you and I should do a show on, actually, coming up before the election, so people can understand our differences in the take on this, but also will give us a chance to talk about what right-wing strategy is. That I think that your fear of elements of it is justified, but it is not actually aiming to do what it sells itself as, which is to overthrow the currently existing order. It actually wants to posit up a counter elite and weaken certain areas of the administrative state to raise up others, which is
I
kind.
do agree with that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the broader point and what matters for this article is just that, like, there's other reformist programs out there. I don't know if you can really call the rights program reformist, but there's other programs out there now which are distinct from the neoliberal order, in a way that this article doesn't really address. And that's not the point of the article exactly, but it is something which uh, doesn't even appear in the background to it.
Yeah, well, that's what makes that whole introduction so interesting to me, because while I do think this is very much of 2018, the enemy it's positing is actually very much of 1990 to like 2007.
Yeah,
It's a right that was already irrelevant by this time, and I think that has to do partly. I mean, we have to give Sam Gindin, Jindin, a little bit. I think it's Jindin. He was a auto worker
in Canada,
union,
I think.
yeah, research director in
Researcher.
Canada from 74 to 2000, and he was like a social justice chair at York University after that. And he wrote a lot of books with Leo Panitch. He's an older dude. I mean, he is in some ways of the similar generation to Bernie Sanders. And unlike a lot of people, he was born in the Soviet Union in Siberia. So he gets some cred there.
For staying a socialist.
But he, grew up in Winnipeg. So, he comes from Russian expatriates. I find him to be quite good when understanding the 2007 to 2012 financial crisis. Actually, I think his book with Liam Panitch on that's actually very good.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the two books that I always tell people to read on it is that one, and then one by Paul Maddock Jr. And then there's one other book. It's hesitant to tell people to read it because its author hates my guts personally, but it's the Kleiman book on the matter. But again, that's already old news by 2018. So
it's
some
kind of like I wish this article was from 2012 instead. You know what I
right.
mean? Like it's like
It would
it's
have been forward
identifying.
facing then.
It would have been very forward facing then, and it still feels like, even if it feels out of date now, like thinking back to that moment, it was of the moment in the sense that it was like, well, we got to do something because there's a chance of us winning, maybe. But it didn't. It doesn't really articulate what you're trying to do, which is not even posit an alternative to liberalism in and of itself, but also an alternative to national conservatism, post fascism, whatever. Should we move on then to the alternative that he comes up with? Because this is my least favorite part of the article.
So you don't like the selection, the section on what is to be done. So let's talk about that a little bit. What do you like about it?
So I think that it backtracks way too much on itself, for one thing. It also, sorry, I'm navigating to the section so I can pick out bit by bit. It starts with the market thing. And it's like some markets are good, some markets are bad, which to me kind of seems like a truism, but you may disagree with it for other reasons.
Well, yeah, that maybe you don't know, but I do not see markets as having a place even in a socialist society, much less a communist one. However, I do not think markets in and of themselves are capitalistic. There are non-capitalist markets, and I am open to the idea that something like markets would be useful for getting feedback on good production, and so a market socialism, in quotation marks, might be a viable way to start figuring out how to build the feedback loops and to get goods and services responsive to public need.
That's
Yeah, go ahead.
that's similar to my feeling, as like they're useful possibly about addressing any information problems which exist. But like, I want to focus on this paragraph here.
Okay.
On the other hand, who can imagine a socialism without a marketplace of coffee shops and bakeries, small restaurants and varieties of pubs, clothing stores, craft shops, and music stores? If the underlying conditions of equality are established so that these markets are about personal preferences, not expressions of power, there is no reason to be defensive about welcoming them. It is when we turn to the commercial activities of workplace collectives that the role of markets takes on their greatest and most controversial significance. So that there's no theory in there, really. But I think it speaks to the underlying assumptions of this middle section about markets in a way that I find negative. I don't think that markets should necessarily be welcomed. They should be used and tolerated.
Yeah.
And I think that like the best way of kind of selling socialism to people is to focus on what will be removed from the market rather than like reassuring them that a market will still exist for these other things. Like, I don't really think it's going to be the job of a socialist government to eliminate like local bookstores.
Yeah.
But it clearly will be to eliminate like labor markets, which, to be fair, this guy says he wants to eliminate, at least in the current form they're in, which
I
is
just don't
again
know
saying like,
how these kinds of stores would work as recognizable to what stores are in petite bourgeois culture right now without a labor market. I'm actually like, what does that even mean? Like,
that's the other thing. Like, it's like, how can you imagine like socialism without restaurants? And like, apparently on Twitter, people fight about this all the time. But it is true that the restaurant industry is like entirely reliant on incredibly low wage labor.
right.
Which is not me being like we have to live in like communal kitchens or cook at home. It's just that like you can't really say, well, the things you like about contemporary society will stay. If you like your this part of contemporary society, you can keep it.
I'm pro communal kitchen, by the way, just so
I'm not
people know.
against it either. Like, I'm in favor of communal kitchens and restaurants and cooking at home. I just like food.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. No, I mean, like, restaurants restaurants and pubs are an interesting example, because I could imagine. Let's. I mean, like, part of the problem here is that, like, what's undergirding this market? Is it labor tokens or is it cash?
it's never addressed. I mean, that is the fundamental thing missing from this middle section.
Mm-hmm.
It says we'll keep markets. It doesn't say what the thing directing the markets is.
Yeah, and it's a big
And
difference whether or not it's labor. Like left communists, council communists are okay with labor tokens in exchange for goods, and in that sense, there would still be, something like markets. They wouldn't necessarily even all be owned by the state, but they would not be profitable.
yeah,
Like, so it's just the two things the two things that are missing from that is, are these things about profitability or not? And
yeah,
if there's no profits, what is your actual signal?
yeah. And
Um, go
it
ahead.
gets like it. He talks about like a social wage, which I guess implies that there's going to be some form of cash or some form of labor tokens. Though again, he doesn't say what it is. But the primary remediation included in this article is just like well, we're going to give everybody the basic necessities and then distribute surplus and also have a stipend for people unwilling to work, which is like, okay, great. Like, that's super cool, but it doesn't really tell me anything.
I mean, that is
Um,
like the bare minimum of socialism, a la Critique of the Goethe program. Like, uh, people will earn their living. Bare minimums will be taken care of. There'll be a social fund for reinvestment and for taking care of those who can't work.
yeah.
Um,
And then like there's this middle section about credit, which I find to be a little annoying because of my like somewhat MMT sympathies. Um, which is, he talks about how there's going to be credit for like starting a co-op or something, and then for consumption, where like I don't like credit for consumption is to me much more suspicious than like broader economic forms of credit in certain ways, because I think it promotes debt, and I don't really know how debt would work in like a socialist economy. Whereas the type of like national, credit creation that comes from, say, a central bank, um, would still probably be necessary, assuming that not every country in the world is socialist, and you have to deal with foreign powers and currency reserves, unless
you
you're
deal with those
authoritarian.
with bombs, Elijah.
Yeah,
No, I'm kidding. I'm joking,
yeah,
but
I know,
not.
I know.
um, I mean, no, I mean, I do think a central bank is okay. So this is real controversial here. Um, I'm one of those people who thinks MMT is a mostly true thing for the developed world. I mean, I have my caveats on very specific issues, but I think like the
It's
the way
basic description of how the economy works
is
is
accurate.
correct.
The way it's basic description of how currency works in the economy is
Yeah,
accurate.
that's
I
better.
actually don't agree with a lot of what they a lot of my bigger issues comes from stuff downstream from that.
Yeah.
Um
But the currency question is, I mean, since we're talking about like credit and stuff like that, that's the central thing here.
right. And so I like you go, why in the hell would we want in a socialist society, like this is to me almost like like one of the things, this is socialism for realists, right? But I'm like looking at this and I'm like, well, there's some key unanswered questions that happen to be the biggest unanswered questions of socialism.
Hmm.
Is money savable to accumulate value or not? So people who don't know the difference between a labor token and currency, there isn't much difference in some ways. They can both serve as I mean,
They're both
you know,
means of exchange.
they're both means of
Uh,
exchange. They both measure time.
they're both used to buy, like, or acquire, I guess, like consumer goods. Um, but I don't believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that labor tokens can be utilized to transform into like acquiring capital and reinvesting.
That's they're specifically designed, and when Marx talks about them, which he doesn't talk about them very much,
Yeah,
but that's to not be that.
exactly.
Like reinvestment is on the level of community and social property, in the early stages national governments, and later stages not. Um, Whereas labor tokens are just a way to account for labor put in, labor put out, so you could have something like fairness, the equalization of the wage in Marx is an incentive for people to work. The difference between this and capitalist society now is, since you're not working for a singular boss, you can actually get labor tokens in multiple ways. So you could have multiple different kinds of job. And the other thing that people are aiming to do is to stabilize the labor tokens and reinvest in long-term productive development in such a way as you can lower necessary labor hours and still increase the value of the labor tokens because the social surplus is higher. that's the way Marx hints at this is going to work. I actually am not sure that labor tokens are still the best way to do it. There's been, I do think there's some cybernetic theories of input that, while I'm a little bit more skeptical of cybernetics than I was in 2020, because of assumptions it makes about human minds. I don't think it affects this as far as like figuring out inputs and getting input and information accurately.
What this goes around is like that there's like a tacit endorsement in here of markets, which I personally am ambivalent about.
Me too. Although I'm more anti-market in the long run than you, but I am ambivalent about it.
Yeah. Without really understanding, well, how are these markets going to function? Because if you're saying we're going to have markets, but you're not saying what the means of organizing the market is, then you're not really doing anything. And I'm left just assuming that we're still going to have cash in some form. It's going to be more equally distributed in some way. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a pretty similar market system in some ways, the one we have now, except with more goods removed from the market, and for some reason, limits on what types of credit are available.
But there is credit, which again,
is credit, which again is like fine, but like, I don't think a socialist society should promote you taking out a loan to buy a car, right? Like that is not really a useful priority.
Personal credit in all forms of my ideal society, in all of its stages, basically doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. Like, and maybe I do understand the idea of like credit on like an industry wide scale, or for a business of some kind, or a co-op or something. Like there's better reasons for it, but like it just goes into like there's very little understanding that I see from this article in suggesting the underlying means by which the market mechanism operates. And from that, I think we've exhausted the markets. So let's go on to the structures.
Yeah, I do want to get into this. So there's one thing.
Yeah, sure.
I want to quote Western the markets. This is in the market section. Workers do not work for others, but collectively organize their labor power with after-tax surplus shared amongst them. Ben Burgess has a similar theme about this.
Yeah.
Income wouldn't be based on receiving the fruits of one's own private labor, since work is collective, not private activity. Those working to get paid for their work hours based on hours worked and the intensity or unpleasantness of the work. Okay, now I want to point this out. Marx makes a big deal out of the former, you get paid for hours worked. He says nothing at all about the unpleasantness of the work or value added. Now, I think it's interesting that there's no like this value. I've seen socialists argue about like we need value added in socialist society. How else we motivate people to do more? And I'm like, you're recapitulating class society. The reason why people would do more is because there's other social status that you get in assuming relative egalitarianism.
Yeah.
From being good at certain kinds of things and needing certain kinds of social goods. And honestly, most of human history has evidence that people operate that way. They don't usually operate. Prestige is actually weirdly not normally accompanied with money in non-bourgeois societies.
Yeah. But I mean, it like basically, yeah, there needs to be some form of incentive operating. Right.
But I do agree that actually maybe dealing with unpleasantness of work, I don't know that it should increase someone's pay, but I do think maybe like, I don't know. I've thought about like, well, certain kinds of work maybe you count for more hours because they're more physically intensive or grosser or whatever.
Yeah. You count it by calories burned. That would be hilarious.
Right. Well, I actually have thought about like.
No, we can't do that. I'm going into the law. No, I'm joking.
No, I have thought. Well, no, I've thought about one of the things that came out of Technocracy Inc. and I have a lot of critiques of technocracy, and I've ranted about it because I think a lot of left communists end up being technocrats without realizing it. But for people who don't know, old technocrats doesn't mean what the word means now. They were basically like socialists who wanted an energy neutral society in the 20s, guys. They were on that gig in the 20s. And they wanted to account for everything and like basically a currency that was equivalency to that. Well, a token that was equivalent to energy use, both labor and also non-labor energy use. And for the energy accounting to basically end up neutral at the end of all transactions. Now, I have no idea how the fuck you do that, but that's an interesting
We'll develop
way
an
to account
algorithm.
for stuff, to account for things, right? And it would account for stuff like intensity of labor because that would actually require more energy.
Yeah.
Because I have thought about the labor tokens like not dealing with intensity of labor at all. And Marx doesn't. And I get why he doesn't, because he is worried about like certain kinds of labor being valorized over others. But
I think it's also true that there were not as wide of variations between the intensity of labor in Marx's day.
No, although he does talk about like collapsing the difference between blue and white collar work, even in his day. So
yeah. No, I'm not saying they didn't exist. I'm just saying that they're like more on the nose now than then.
oh yeah,
Especially as socialists are increasingly like downwardly mobile professionals rather than like factory workers. So they're like,
although not all factory work actually requires a whole lot of physical labor. But yes,
also true.
you're right.
Yeah. Should we talk about work?
Yeah, let's get into the work in the sections. I mean, I just
Like a sectoral council section, layers of planning.
I do want to talk about. There's a couple other this that I guess we didn't get because we don't. You're right. He doesn't answer markets, and he wants to get rid of labor markets.
Yeah,
but part of this is, this is wild to me. And I'll just read it. While authoritarian market discipline imposed under capitalism will no longer exist, workplace collectivists will still generally operate in a market context of buying inputs and selling their goods or services, or if the final project has no market price of measurable output targets. Oh, that's a big caveat, asterisk. Like, okay, so there's some stuff we know doesn't have a market price, but we're going to maintain markets, and we're going to maintain markets for profitability, but the profitability is going to be shared between co-op firms. To me, that's just co-op capitalism. But anyway, incentives to act socially sensitive ways, such as operating efficiently, consequently remain necessary. This would take the form of a portion of the surplus being generated by the collective going to its members as a collective good, housing, sports, culture, or as an income for private consumption.
I'm also anticipating the absolutely fantastic like social criticism and like realist fiction, which will emerge from this as like one social co-op becomes a guild and refuses to allow anyone else in.
Which is obviously going to happen in this setup. This brings a mechanism for bringing opportunity cost into decision making, such as how valuable an input is if used elsewhere and how valuable others consider the final product. This, however,
operating off feelings.
Yep, those good old market vibes. This, however, also reintroduces the negative side of markets. Why the fuck would we want to do that? The incentives that imply competition, which means winners and losers, and therefore non-egalitarian outcomes.
Like, I don't think like this is my like overall thing. Like, I don't necessarily think any of this is totally unrealistic in demonstrating what like possible aspects of a transitional state would look like. Like, yeah, there'd still be some markets, we'd still have some of the negatives, but it's like really great that he's like, yeah, we're going to reintroduce some of the negatives. We have the opportunity to start completely fresh because we're designing utopia. So let's just make sure we have all of the negative aspects of markets still taking place.
But they're just collectivized now. Like that's it's like all right. Moreover, if those workplaces earn large enough surplus to choose to invest more, their competitive advantage would be reproduced. How?
Also, like that, this is like another thing where it's like if there's a business which is like measurably, or a worker co-op which is like measurably better than another one, and it's not like for some immobile reason, like, I don't know, particularly like cool guy works there, or it has like easy access to nearby natural resources, I would want to replicate this. Like, if they figure out something at one place, uh, then you want to implant it in like other business or other, cooperatives doing the same thing, right?
So
You don't want to just like be like, yeah, the wisdom of the market will figure it out, especially because later when they're talking about the efficiency, they're like, the information problem will be solved because people will share their information. And it's like, okay, so a lot of the major reasons why we have unequal competition then go away. Um,
yeah,
you know,
this is why I was confused by this, because I'm like, in some ways, this is not, when we're talking about socialism for realists, I'm like, you're maintaining things that are contradicted by other things you're maintaining, and I don't know why you're maintaining them.
yeah,
Except that I guess you don't want to scare people off, because one of the things that's interesting about this is social democracy plus syndicalism plus I'm going to actually be a little bit controversial. There's some integralist implied here, because there's still classes. There just isn't a capitalist class. And what else? Plus cancelism, plus some other shit. Like, it's
there's still the plan too.
right. Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a Gauss plan element. So there's classical Marxist Leninism in here. It's just
Which
like,
I don't have a problem with like mixing all these things together. I
no, me
just feel
neither.
like I think they should be mixed together. I don't think that like it's realistic or even like desirable in a moment of like weakness to insist on your like own section. Not like a no enemies to the left type of thing, but just like, oh, we have the freedom because we're so weak to borrow from one another.
Right. Well,
But the way
I
it works here is it just
mm,
like takes a bunch of like elements and like throws them together and it's like, this kind of works. It's like, does it? I'm not sure.
yeah, but as we're talking about with these markets, it doesn't answer significant
The
things.
significant questions. It doesn't borrow from like different tendencies within the left to be like, well, if you combine these like two things, we solve this question. Which, like, to be fair, is a big ask. Because that's the reason we're still arguing about all this stuff.
I
Uh,
mean, yeah. I
but
mean, I
it doesn't even
do.
try. It just skips over like a lot of the principal differences.
Right. I mean, I do think, for example, the age-old battle between syndicalist, anarcho, and otherwise, and councilist, communist are, who else is councilist? I think it's only really communist. There might be council anarchist, I guess. And the reason why those distinctions came up is the councilists would say, like, look, you communize a firm, but overall production still works capitalistically. So we need councils to develop, based off of the Soviet and German council model in 1918 and 1919, to actually administer this shit, which is also very similar. I mean, I will say this. I think the difference is councilists in the anarchist world don't call themselves councilists. They call themselves platformists. So, but it is those combinations. I actually kind of like those combinations as like ways to nest worker organization. As opposed to like the, say, Bordigist or Marxist Leninist answer, which is like the party state.
Yeah. And
Which
I mean, I think it's to the author's credit that he's opposed to the party state.
yeah,
Because
explicitly, that's one of the few things he actually hard cuts out. Like, we're not doing that. Like,
yeah, which is not like also it's not like eliminating parties or the state. It's like so it's not but it is saying we're not gonna have a party state.
no,
Which
it is saying we're not going to fuse the party with the state
yeah,
and have the party be the state, which
which to me is a good call.
yeah, I mean, I would say the Bordigists are slightly better than the MLs sometimes, because they believe that the party should represent all the proletariat, but then they're also weirder because they somehow think the proletariat would be homogenous.
Yeah.
Which is just weird to me that that would be a conclusion you would draw. But they tend to Anyway, so I mean,
So after this, we have like sectoral councils.
yeah, and I
This
think
is like
this is not. This is
this is fine.
This is
Like
like I would do this. Like,
this part was good. It was like it's like we should have people who are like work in the jobs of a particular sector have control over that sector.
I mean,
And
like,
like
duh.
I'm like, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Though it does like start out at the beginning with this like really funny thing. It's like overly ambitious planning in the Soviet case and overly autonomous workplaces, the Yugoslav case, have both failed as models of socialism. It's like time for a third position. No, but
No,
it
there
is.
are some times where I'm like, this sounds like national syndicalism, and we're just not going to talk about where that ended up, huh?
Yeah,
But
no,
like,
I was kind of picking that up, but like that's like a very uncharitable reading of
it's
this,
the
and
most uncharitable reading. I would
and
not
it's
call Sam Gindin
completely
a fascist.
it's completely not intentional. It just like speaks to the fact that there's a lot of tensions between different elements. However, the
Right.
sectoral councils element is pretty reasonable, and I think one probable reason for that is that his background is as a research director in the automotive industry, which is one of the industries which could perhaps best be represented by sectoral councils, and indeed has the most worker influence over boards of like any major industry in the United States,
Right.
uh,
And in Canada too, I think.
and in Canada, and it does work well for that. I mean, it like doesn't it obviously is not worker controlled because that's illegal for some reason. Even if they buy it through the market, um, thanks Supreme Court. But like the point of this is like, yeah, sectoral councils are good. Uh, they're going to have to discuss things with one another. It's a good way of sharing information, and it's a good way of governing things as sectors rather than uh, either as individual companies or some like overall state apparatus run exclusively through a ministry, which will probably not be as successful in my mind.
No, because it would be too externally bureaucratic. And the other thing is that all these people would have skin in the game in their own industries. Thus, the mentors, the quote red experts, or organic and provisional, which meets my acceptable temporary hierarchy criterion. For those of you who don't know, like I think hierarchies don't require classes if they're provisional and removable, because I admit that we're not all equal in capacity. Like we're just not. Like every cook can govern, but not every cook can be a nuclear physicist. So, or a weightlifter for that matter. I mean, like,
Yeah,
or a trash man. So,
and some of us can't even be cooks. Like
yeah.
um,
So, um, I do like this idea that it both is relatively flattening, has people advising, larger sectors of planning from expertise learned by doing the work as well as any additional training that they get.
and like I also think that this is uh, a more compelling vision than the earlier section is. Like
Absolutely.
it
There's no
sounds
like we're
like
not sneaking back in capitalist incentives
yeah,
just for
it's just like
reasons.
you will be in charge of your workplace, and your workplaces will be more cooperative uh, in some way on a sectoral basis, and it's easy to understand. Also, like
Yeah.
sectoral bargaining is already extant in a lot of the world, and sectoral governance is not that far away from that. We
No.
currently have in sectoral bargaining a type of sectoral governance. It's just one which includes management.
Right.
Um,
And in this year you're a manager. I mean, like you're a manager plus whatever the larger section of society doing the planning is. And I like this idea of like nested governments, because I do worry about this in people who listen to the show know that I worry about this way a lot. This tendency that Marxists have to have a naive 19th century view of efficiency and centralization that like just ignores even lessons from fucking physics about the limits of that. Whereas having nested levels of control, government, and expertise that are all, you're all these kinds of, yes, it's still somewhat representational. Although I would actually say at the level of the firm, it wouldn't be representational, it would be direct.
Yeah.
At the level of like,
I mean, this is the layers of planning section, basically.
right. Yeah, let's get into the layers of planning, because I actually think this I also start with fairly smart. So to give
yeah, I thought this was pretty reasonable. I did think it really did like again, I kind of thought it was like a little mundane because it was like, in some cases we will need centralization, and in some cases we will need decentralization.
yeah,
I'm
and
like, yep, that's
duh.
true. And it's like, and planning should occur at the best possible level. And it's like, yeah, that's also true. Uh, and it has like this list of things that like would be important for the central planning board to do.
Yeah,
Um,
let's go through that, because I actually find this sort of, I'll just read all 10
I thought
because
it was really funny.
guaranteeing full employment, universal access to necessities, and a living income.
That sounds good.
Okay, sure. Uh Setting the relationship between the present and future consumption through determining the shared GDP to be allocated in investment. Why the fuck do we still have GDP in socialism?
No, that was what made me laugh. Like I was like I get that it's like just like explaining what it means to the lay reader who's operating ostensibly, unless they're reading far in the future from a capitalist framework. Um, but it's also just such a funny idea to me to have like central planning board is like, this year we're doing 2% more GDP to investment and growth. And it like that's like just the phrase that they're using. Like it doesn't capture anything, but whatever.
Yeah, I
Um
mean, it's just I'm trying to figure out, particularly if you're not in market competition with non-capitalist society, I mean, with non-socialist societies, what would that even mean? Like,
yeah,
I
it's
don't
like
have any
it's
idea.
completely pointless. And it's countervailing to like the efficiency argument later, which I also thought was fine. Where he's like, the efficiency argument, I'm just gonna sum up right now because it's really boring. It's saying we shouldn't necessarily measure socialism through the standards of capitalist efficiency, but
Duh.
it has to be reasonably efficient so that we can produce things. Yes, I agree with that. So we're gonna skip that entire last section
Yeah,
because it's completely
We'll come
pointless.
back to that, because I was just like, okay, duh. Also, that the hint about discussing efficiency that way is always my way of talking about when we hit the growth or degrowth socialism.
Debate, which this just skips over. It's like,
yeah,
we
well,
don't even care about that.
that was barely a debate when this was written, to be fair,
That's
but
true. That's
like
true.
it did
Let's keep
exist.
let's keep
But let
going
me
through
go
the
through this
list.
list. Allocating investment to sectors and regions, which in turn would reallocate within their respective jurisdictions. That makes sense. Generating revenue for its activities. So
Well, for the taxes we had earlier.
the central planning has to generate revenue for its activity. I guess that's why we still have taxes. Although, again, I don't know. I
What
actually
a
don't know
tax entails.
why you need taxes in a socialist society, since you're already controlling income distribution.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, you're like just distributing. But anyway, curbing
Yeah.
impediments to society's solidarity and equality goals, not only across individuals/households, but across workplace, collective sectors, and regions.
So
That
okay.
is like so unclear to me because, like, is
Is
he?
this the wokeness council, or is this something else? Like, I actually couldn't even figure out what he was talking about.
No,
Like,
like what was my feeling? Like, I was like, is so we have like the Bureau of Woke within the Central Planning Committee, and it's like, okay, that's like fine, but it's just like really funny. It's like, yeah, the Central Planning Board, one of its most important roles, in addition to directing the entirety of the economy, is like making sure that solidarity isn't affected. we hire like 10 psychoanalysts to like sit in a room and be like what the psychological effects of the plan will be. Which like again, like
I
we're
actually
being
don't. I mean, part
a
of me
little
doesn't
mean
think
with
that's a
this.
bad idea if that's what it said, but like, it's not clear
It's just not clear what it means. Like, it's like, should we like fight racism? Yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea. Like,
but it's
should that
also,
necessarily be handled by the central planning board? Like, maybe, I'm not sure.
but also like the way it's worded, it could also refer to other things because like if it's just about fighting racism, I don't know why you need to look at it in collective sectors and regions. So there's other things he's attaching to that, but I don't know
Yeah,
what
and
they are.
like one of the things I like really dislike about this is that like regional inequality is like mostly it like it's illogical in the way it operates now, but it is logical that there would be like differences between regions, which is like what inequality is fundamentally. It's difference. It's just that certain forms of differences are fine and certain forms are like are bad. But like
Right.
does this mean therefore the same thing as like point three, where it's like, coal is cheap here, but fish is cheap here. Let's make it so that there's like an efficient like national market so that we can get things the same price in two places. Like it just doesn't tell you what it means.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yes. And again, so it's one thing if I'm going to be like, if you're going to draw these blueprints for the future, you either need to be vaguer or more specific, but you are somehow neither warm nor hot, like or cold. I mean, it's just you're kind of
yeah,
slightly
you're
below the
like,
temperature of spit.
let's
Like,
keep going because this is so fun. The constant development through educational institutions and at work of popular functional skills and democratic and cultural capacities.
what the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, it's like good things will be promoted. Governing
Yeah,
the pace. Oh wait, this one is great. Governing the pace of decommodification through the distribution of expenditures between collective and individual consumption. It's like, but we still have commodity markets. We established that earlier. So it's like we'll temporarily this guy is like governing like how quickly the market for widgets gets abolished.
yeah. I was actually saying like because the market section doesn't imply that the markets are temporary.
Yeah. And so
Like,
like if they're temporary, that's like a completely different thing. But also there's gonna be like Klug, once you have like a market established, it's gonna like sink in.
right, and so you
Which like
need to
again doesn't mean that like you have to do it all at once. It just means that like you can't then be like, no, it's cool. We got a decommodifier on it. His name's Klaus, like whatever.
he's from the auto union sector. Like, um, yeah, it's just okay, sure. Regulating the production leisure trade off by influencing the share of productivity that goes in producing more versus producing the same in fewer hours.
So is
I
that like
will.
setting labor hours?
Yeah, this actually is implied in Marx. Like, one of the goals of communism is reduce the hours of work. Period. What? Why are you reinvesting to
To reduce
create?
work hours. Yeah,
To
this one I don't really have a problem with. Like,
right.
as so long as it's obviously like different based on sector or whatever.
Right. And for
Um,
those of you who don't know what we talk about when we're reducing the hours of work, we're reducing the hours of work you have to do for work you don't want to do. So, like, the more we can automate for shit work, the better. Because when people are like, "Oh, you're going to be a poet in the new society or a laborer," and I'm like, "You're going to be both, motherfucker." That's the fucking point.
like
Like,
you do both now. You just have like less time for the one you want to do.
right? It's about to
Um,
say, like, it's not like I get to like as a poet, I would just like I don't know. I feel like I would have a very in regards to being both an artist and something else, I think I would actually do that in both societies. It's just it's way easier for me in a socialist society, and I
no.
know that I'm probably gonna have to clean
And
toilets for an
I'll
hour
be
a
a
day.
workaholic in both. It's just that
Me
in
too,
one I'll be
actually.
working in like a law firm, and in the future I'll be working in a gulag, um,
Yes,
as a prisoner, um,
because you worked at the law firm. I mean, I
because
know
I
how
worked at the law firm.
we know how we know one of the ironies of training our best PMS strata. That's a redundant. acronym. But
Yeah.
anyway, professional strata peeps is that we're eventually going to have to make them do what they do now in a gulag until they to commodify
That's okay.
themselves.
I'll just flee if it's necessary. But anyway,
It'll be
enforcing the
nice gulag.
stringent.
I'm basing gulags off of the Swedish model. No, okay, go ahead.
That'd be nice. Enforcing the stringent. It's like my current apartment, except with worse furniture. Enforcing the stringent adherence to environmental standards, with the state ownership and pricing of resources, as well as allocation of investment, being critical here.
Okay. Oh, we have state price fixing and a market. What?
It's awesome. Maybe there's just like price ceilings, or maybe there's price floors.
So is it price? I mean, is it pricing for like crucial?
It's like how much nickel will cost.
Right. So it's
that's like literally just determined by how much you can produce.
Right.
So it's just like, I don't know, it's like addressing the information problem anew just for like inputs, I guess.
Yeah, it's addressing the information problem for inputs, and I guess also saying you're gonna factor in environmental stability.
We've got the best one is number 10. Navigating the relationship with what will likely still be a predominantly capitalist global economy.
Again, how do you navigate that? Warplanes. No,
well, unfortunately you can't navigate it through credit markets because we've abolished those in international currency, but not for buying a car. But no, that's like
oh man.
I'm going to read the footnote for this one.
Okay,
international relations raise a host of issues not addressed here, ranging from complex relations with capitalist countries to relations of solidarity with the global south, parentheses, passing on technology and skills and paying fair prices, in parentheses, to negotiating planned relations with other socialist countries. So like I do love that one of the implications there is that the global south will still be capitalist. And also, like, how do you do trade between? Anyway, whatever.
How do you trade between a poor capitalist country and a rich socialist one?
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
Fair prices.
The fact that this is methodologically nationalistic strikes me as Canadian brain rot, but which is the least fair thing I can say.
This is actually what America would look like now if we'd annexed Canada in the War of 1812 and therefore abolished slavery democratically.
That, you know what? As an alternate history, I think Gindin and Panich would be vindicated by that. Every now and then I am sort of finished the War of 1812 and the Canadians get all huffy and I'm like, look, you're going to make us better. I don't know what your problem is. Like,
yeah, it's like all of our problems would have been fixed if we had like hundreds of thousands of angry Quebecois serving in the Union Army. But anyway, it's completely beside the point. Part 3, socialist efficiency.
And that is we can be pretty efficient, but we don't need to be as efficient as capitalists do because we're not trying to generate profits that way.
Yeah. And it's also like people will innovate because they like it. And it's like, okay, great, nice. I think that's kind of like the article.
Yeah. I mean, there's a conclusion, and I guess I can go through his bullet points of the conclusion real fast, and we can talk about
do that.
Because this is his vision, really. Worker collectives, worker control of their workplaces is fundamental to socialism, but fragmented control forces the question of how workers' particular interests can be mediated with the social interest and how to retain worker autonomy against the directives from above. Essential to addressing this is a role for markets. This is actually the syndicalist versus communist debate, like, answered. Like, okay, fine, we can have syndicates, but you still have to answer to larger social planning stuff. All right. Markets that simply accommodate choices are welcome to socialist project, but labor and capital markets, which undermine primary socialist principles, must be prohibitive. And I am with you. Like, how the fuck do you get rid of capital markets if you're still assuming a capitalist world order?
Yeah. I guess he means domestically, maybe. which is like still impossible, basically. But whatever.
And then I don't know how the other markets are profitable if you don't have a labor market.
What if we just like have like a national investment fund?
Yeah,
It's
for
just
real.
like, and that is the central planning board.
Yeah, the commercial markets and the workplace collectives are embedded, are practical necessaries, but they also bring in competition. They threaten egalitarian goals. I also want to point out here, maybe Elijah, you're different than me. I am only a power egalitarian.
Yeah, I don't
So
really care if like about other forms of equality. Like I'm not a
right.
social status egalitarian.
No,
Um,
I like I have a problem with classes. So I don't want the ability of like things to be the division of labor to be so strict that there are social goods that you can only get from that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I also want people to have basic dignity for, I'm a power egalitarian, and I think if you are a power egalitarian, then there's a lot of other stuff like racism and sexism, etc. You got to tamp down on. But like, I don't care if like someone's better at baseball than me. I'm not trying to like socialism is not a Harrison Bergeron universe.
yeah,
And so all this focus on egalitarianism and threatening egalitarian goals, I'm like, well, I don't have a problem with difference. I have a problem with like,
with like somebody ruling somebody else,
right.
uh, like I guess unreasonably.
And the
By which
reason
I would
why,
mean like you can still have like democracy and be like you're in charge of the shop floor.
yeah,
Um,
although I should be able to get rid of you by democratic vote on like at an instant, like
yeah,
honestly. Um, so, I mean, this is this I would. I just don't. I don't. The markets part is the part where I'm like, I get what you're trying to do, but I don't understand. Like, you don't work out enough how this actually works for me to know if I
yeah,
think this is a horrible regression, which is my inclination because there's a whole lot of language of capitalism in those sections still. Or if it's like fine. But then I'm like, the idea you can have markets for things you like, but not anything that's important is also weird. Like,
yeah.
all right, sectional councils. The conversion of state ministries to sectional workers' councils constituted by delegates from each workplace collective in the sector serves two critical purposes. I guess the councilists would have a problem with this because there's delegates. But anyway, it brings about a major shift in the balance of power between workers in the state, between collective worker and the central plan, and provides sectoral councils with the capacity and authority to regulate markets to the narrowing down of productive gaps between workplaces. This is the only thing in here that I think, like, I do think, well, workplace collective and workers councils together, you could probably sell people on, like,
Yeah.
as a vision of the future.
Well, you know who tried to do that is Ronald Reagan also.
I mean, shush. Yes, but spatial devolution. Okay, this I don't even remember till here. The regional evolution of planning highlights the importance of urban restructuring local services, community, and culture. Now, I
Oh
would
no, I
include in
remember when he
this.
was talking about this. He was like there were experiment. This is one of the funniest references in here, which is like the references the Soviet like deurbanization projects.
Mhm.
Um, where they were like, we love cars now because it means you can like live in like a commune that you like share with people on the communal like farm or whatever. Uh, but I mean, it's anyway, it's beside the point. Point
Well, I
is,
mean,
like,
this is interesting. There's really crazy experiments that never actually happened in the Soviet Union, but during the early planning phase, when Lenin was still alive, before the Red Terror, like so very early. But like they were like had this vision of like everything, including houses and apartments and stuff, being on rails. Um,
that's sick. We should go back to that.
like like so that you could just like move your communal apartment in with your partner's communal apartment, and then you could like move it around on rail somewhere else, because again, no cars yet. um or not in Russia. The
I think this proves that like the particular type of neurodivergence where you love trains has always been overrepresented within the socialist movement.
Yes. This is why Enzo Traverso starts his book on revolution with trains.
So true.
But yeah,
I
I
also
do.
do have like 5 minutes left, so let's speed through the rest of these.
Okay. It brings planning closer to those affected. I also do think like this is fair in the trying to deal with the problems of town and country here, which is normally just socialists don't even touch that.
Mhm.
Layers of planning, we've talked about it. There's multiple layers. Central planning board. This this I mean
There's so many hedges here. It's great. It's like while the move to layers of planning undermines the power of the social oligarchy, it does not necessarily undermine the capacity of the Central Planning Board (parentheses CPB). No longer as overloaded, the CPB may become more effective. The new sector and regional capacities may become useful vehicles for carrying out the center's key plans. And as the CPB gives up for some functions, others may become even
you know
more
what is
important
interesting? I don't
as
know
new ones become necessary.
how is the central planning board decided on again in this schema?
It wasn't said.
It wasn't said. Yeah, that's weird.
It's selected amongst whoever writes the best performing Jacobin magazine article in the past year.
Yeah, transformation of the state. We don't try to get rid of the state. We just try to fully democratize everything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if you fully democratize everything, why the fuck do you need a state? Do it like it's a question of what a state is not answered here.
No.
Because like a state for me involves a standing military, and you might need that where there's capitalist societies, but the goal is going to be that you don't ultimately need that. But he's saying, no, it's going to be there. We're not going to try to get rid of it anymore. Like, and I'm like, but okay, you seem to like democratization and planning, but you're not thinking of the fact the state's a fucking army. Like, it's just, it's weird. Liberal political freedoms, contested elections, political parties. I mean, cool.
I like this last one. Socialism's messiness. Against notions of socialism's omnipotent capacity to plan for what is to come, it is likely to be an especially messy form of social organization. This should not be taken as a slur. Rather, it follows from everything that is inspiring about socialism. Its contingency is a contested process of experimentation, discovery, learning, the most ambitious democratic and egalitarian goals, the opening to creatively participate in the great variety of life. An inspiring call to be a little messy sometimes.
I feel like this was written by a guy who came to social democracy because he was a Trotskyist, but then decided that he liked contemporary China. And I don't know that to be Gindin's politics, to be completely honest, but it does feel a little bit like that. I want to talk to you though. I guess we've been kind of slagging us, particularly on this last part. I would say 60% good, 40% bad. I love as a good socialist making up percentages for shit, but
that's actually the first thing that the Central Planning Board will do.
Yeah,
they'll have a bureau of invented percentages.
Exactly. So that we have to, when we comment on the past, we can back Lenin. 70% good, 30% bad. George Washington, 50% good, 50% bad. It's gonna be one of the central things they do. But we talked about this though. I find only 3 elements of this to be like inspiring as a vision of a future. And everything else just seems kind of muddled.
Yeah.
And weirdly unnecessarily, because some of the muddledness is maintaining elements of capitalism while not clarifying what these elements you're maintaining really truly are.
I think the parts of this article I liked, which is like probably the same ones as you, which is the sectoral councils, like layers of planning was fine, the efficiency thing was fine, or the components which I wish this had just like entirely been about, because I think they were the most like viable components for what this was trying to do in 2018, which is like, hey, Bernie, like, you don't have to limit yourself to this stuff. You can, like, do other things. And, like, a sectoral council, for example, would be a radical redistribution of power
Mhm.
in actually existing society, which would afford the opportunity to develop further.
Yeah.
Um, so, like, the parts we liked are the parts which were basically like reformism done right, and the
Reformism
parts,
as actual reformism is not just fucking band-aids, even though I'm not a reformist. Like, this
yeah,
is what it would be.
yeah, and the parts we didn't like were like revolution done wrong, which is like
Yeah.
we're going to abolish markets and then put them back in. Um,
Yep. But only in the parts we like. And somehow we're not gonna have them in the parts we don't like.
yeah, well,
Like,
that's what socialism's all about. The things I like will be free and enforced for everyone, and then the things I dislike will be illegal and punishable by death. Um, like,
so you know what's notably I mean, actually disturbingly, as I was kept on joking about, hey, we deal with this problem internationals with bombs, and I'm joking, people, but in a very real sense,
what are you, a Posadist now?
no. Um, well, I mean, if you nuke the capitalist powers, they're no longer there. No, I'm kidding. I don't actually believe that. I don't believe in mass death of that scale. The issue that I have with this, in the other sense, that's both bad for this, but actually interesting to compare to what we kind of feel like is the vision of socialism today. Um, so I feel like this has something like it is incoherent about what is maintaining from current society, and it just doesn't deal with the international question whatsoever. It implies that this can happen within one country, and be viable, and
And then
and
promptly assuming that that country is the US or the UK gives away its biggest asset, which is its like fiscal capacity or monetary capacity. Excuse me.
right,
Sorry.
right,
Still annoyed about that.
but keeps it internally somehow.
Yeah.
Like, and also trades with capitalist nations and doesn't go to war with them, all even though it's lost its ability to leverage international currency. So, like, which would imply that war really would be the only option. Um,
Or would be at least more likely.
right.
Um,
And so, okay, but I'm gonna give it credit. You know what it doesn't have in it? Socialism as a revenge fantasy,
that's completely true. I
which is
which is
kind of the predominant mode of socialism, but when I was growing up, and it's back being the predominant mode today, I think.
yeah. Um yeah, except like instead now it's like socialism is the revenge fantasy of whoever was the second most recent population to administer a territory for some reason. Um,
Mm.
which is like even less. That's going to make some people angry. Um, which is, I think, like a less useful revenge fantasy in some ways than revenge fantasy against like boss,
Or the
um,
capitalists. Yeah,
or the
yeah.
capitalists, which actually has like more of a chance of happening, or can lead to something more productive, in my
Well,
opinion.
this is socialism as just geopolitics done shitty. Is a terrible, terrible idea. And it leads to third worldism, which I have been on record as saying I don't just find to be theoretically wrong, although I do. I find it to be morally reprobate on what it's asking for the most oppressed workers to do.
Yeah,
Um,
especially since it seems, especially as it manifests in the developed world. I think
right.
I have a
Um,
lot fewer qualms with the third worldist living in the developing world.
yeah, well, I mean, fair. But the weird thing is, I'm not saying there's no third worlds in the developing world. There's plenty, but I meet the most batshit ones where third worldism and developing world is often I want decolonialize. I don't want, and I want independence from these major powers, and you'd like you to leave. And a lot of it ends up being methodologically nationalist too, in a way that's not particularly helpful, but like
But like it's understandable.
completely
Um,
understandable. Whereas in the developed world, it's like I'm asking someone to do all this stuff who's far away that I don't have a relationship with, and also I'm implying that every person who's beneath me in my own society is shit, which is the other implication. It's why it's like a double immorality, and it comes from giving up. And the other political subject that we've gone back to, despite years of criticizing it, we're back to the students as the primary like mode of history, as a that somehow 19 to 21-year-olds from elite schools are the. I mean, I've heard it from liberals and leftists lately. They're the conscience of the progressive movement, or the conscience of the left, and I'm like,
in a decade they'll be making a lot of money. It'll be fun. No, but that was a little tongue in cheek. Yeah, I mean, I'm also, as we've discussed many times during our Lash episodes, incredibly skeptical of students, like not just as committed revolutionaries, but especially as leaders of any like theoretical revolutionary movement. When the point of being a student, or the effect of being a student, is that you're in one place for 4 years, sectioned off from the rest of the world. 4 to 8 years, whatever. Like, I'm still here. But
with relatively few social responsibilities compared to everybody else.
yeah,
And also you're there to get skills, questionably at this point, but to get skills to then refine in actual work. The fact, I mean, I think Lash is right that the reason why students are the primary actors is cynical, but also kind of inevitable given the structure of our current society in some ways.
yeah,
Because we don't try to organize where people can integrate their lives into this political situation. And as long as we don't do that, it is, what is the thing about Occupy? If you really take David Graeber's thing seriously and don't have demands, and the ultimate goal is the occupation, but the only people who really can participate in that are the richest students and the poorest unemployed. And I've seen a lot of that as like a left strategy. I used to like get into fights with my partner about it, actually, because we go out and help the homeless people, which I very much believe in doing. But I would point out, like, well, it's a bunch of like future lawyers from rich families trying to protect the poorest people, while we're not talking about the people just above these homeless people, who are not out here helping
because they have to work.
because they have to work, and because frankly a lot of these homeless people complicate their lives. Whereas for you, this is a way to express conscience and solidarity with someone who is way further down, but it's effectively a form of noblesse oblige. And when it comes to third worldism, that is that on a global scale.
Yeah. I mean, I also think, like, I mentioned this right before we got on,
Mhm.
and it's kind of the thing I'll leave the audience with, because I do have to go.
Mhm.
To me, ultimately, the thing which makes socialism for realists better than what I see in the contemporary moment, which is socialism for unrealists, um, is that the claim in Socialism for Realists is that we should design structures which will bring about a better world, and that it's going to be a lot of hard work, and that we have to convince people close to us, and farther away, to get on our side. And the activating principle I see most prominently now, in the post-Bernie movement, or moment, is basically a replication of the Sorelian general strike myth, except with the general strike substituted for uprising of some kind,
It's
localized
basically
in.
a Sorelian misreading of Franz Fanon.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and that, based on the vibes of revolution we get from that, we'll be able to keep going forever and ever and ever. And I don't
Well,
think that's true.
totally exhaust society or kill thousands of people needlessly or anything like that. No, you're not going to unlock a social floodgates that starts with getting rid of actual enemies, but ends with someone getting mad at their girlfriend and turning them over to a terror squad.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, it's historically what happens when you do that kind of shit. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
I think it's good to assume that people are people. And I see that assumption in socialism for realists by trying to design a different society for humans, however far short it falls, uh, and whatever it misses. Whereas there's an oscillation between a utopian vision of what humans can be and a dooming of people who have acted incorrectly to the status of enemy for all time from a lot of people in the current moment. And I don't think that's helpful.
No, I think that is Carl Schmitt plus Sorrell plus. I mean, it doesn't help that two out of the three people I've mentioned are fascist. I'm just
Yeah.
like, Sorrell wasn't. Yes, Sorrell ended up endorsing Mussolini, guys. So just so you know, he dies. He doesn't explicitly join the fascist party, but he dies more or less
A fascist.
endorsing the fascists.
Yeah.
And honestly, the Sorelian myth stuff is a part of Lash that one day we'll have to talk about that because that's late Lash. But like, it's a part of Lash that I find the most disturbing is he's got a real soft spot for Sorel at the end of his life, and I'm like, bad idea. But anyway, thank you so much, Elijah, the second most regular person on the show. I've decided to not name your segment because if I do, you don't get put on the main the main podcast feed anymore. Weirdly, I don't know why them's the rules, but somehow them's the rules. So, thank you. Have a great. People can find your work here, and whatever else you do. What else do you do?
I'm probably going to be coming out with a note and an article of some kind in the near future. I'm not going to spoil the topics because people just get mad at me. But when it comes out, you can read them and then yell at me in person. And I just want to say thanks for having me, and thank you, listeners, for listening in.
All right.